The countdown has begun. We are only 6 days away to a potential massive crash in the market. Let's roll that intro and get right down into it. Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. Welcome back to another walk and talk video. Now this video is something that I think is of the utmost importance that we must all listen to and all kind of adhere to, because there is a big problem and it all stems from what happened back in 2021 and 2022. This is a legacy problem and we're about to see the next wave of banks potentially collapsing. This is a pretty big problem, specifically in the US, but I do think other parts of the world are also going to be affected by this exact issue. Okay, so back in January, I spoke briefly about a banking crisis over in the US. We've seen a lot of outflows, money kind of leaving regional banks, and it has caused a massive problem. Now, this problem is isolated more to the regional side banking, the regional side of the banking sector, than it is to do with the government-backed, banking sector. So, centralized banks and things like that, they're actually faring up reasonably well, mainly because they can print their own capital whenever they need it, right? You know what I'm saying. Now, back in 2021, we do know that the US printed a stupid amount of dollars. This was pretty much driven out from, what was going on in 2020 with the pandemic, the stimulus checks. I think there was a stupid stat out there, like 25%, if not more, of the US dollars in circulation were printed in 2020 and 2021 alone, which is just astonishing. That printing, that behavior, creates inflation. I don't even need to tell you guys this, but you kind of get the idea anyway. Overprinting, devaluing your own asset or your own fiat currency, and as a result of that, pushing the price up of your everyday goods, right? You're devaluing how much spending power you have when you go ahead and print more. This caused inflation to spike, and all of this was happening whilst the centralized banks were offloading bonds. Okay, so when I'm talking about a banking crisis, we have to understand what led into this, how these banks, these regional banks, have got themselves into a position where your hard-earned money is going to be utilized to bail themselves out to a degree. I think when I say bailout, I don't mean necessarily that they're going to survive, more that your money has been lent out over and over and over and over again, and they've got themselves into such a predicament that they no longer have your capital in the banks. This is a huge, huge problem. Now, as I said, it's more isolated to regional banks, but in the next 6 days, we kind of have a hard date here where a lot of regional banks potentially are going to be bankrupt. And this means that if your money is in a regional bank, you've got 6 days to get it out. You've got to be basically doing essentially a bank run, getting your capital moved to a more safer bank, a more kind of centralized non-regional bank. Now, not all regional banks will be affected, but I do expect a significant portion of them to be. Okay, these are more your retail banks, if you will. Ultimately, what the Federal Reserve and other centralized banks did around the world in 2020 was offload bonds. Bonds are normally a bit of a safe haven as an investment option. Here in the UK, we saw a lot of pension funds buying up bonds during 2020 and 2019. All of those were offloaded from, of course, the government-backed bonds from the central banks. Now, those centralized banks basically offloaded those bonds at a premium rate. Basically, on the assumption that interest rates would stay low and the bonds will go up in value over time. That is kind of what the pension funds and a lot of these institutions and other regional banks were doing. They were buying up the government-backed bonds, thinking that they're a safe bet. Basically what the central banks did, and the Federal Reserve, was then, after selling all these bonds as safe bets to the regional banks, bumped up the interest rates. That dropped the value of the bonds, making these regional banks go from cash positive, or on the balance sheet anyway, to negative. They started losing billions upon billions of dollars. And so we are now just a few years down the line from that. We saw 2020, we saw lots of regional banks suffer and go into liquidation and get bought up by the larger banks, right? We saw this during kind of 2020 and up to even the FTX crash. Now, with these regional banks running out of capital and reaching breaking point yet again, we're going to see more banks going into potential bankruptcy, these regional banks. This is going to then either mean that there's going to be larger centralized banks looking to swallow up these smaller regional banks and become bigger and better, if you will, or we're going to see them go bankrupt and go into liquidation, which means if your money is in these government-backed banks, these regional banks, you potentially lose your capital. The other option, of course, is that this speeds up the Federal Reserve pivoting on their interest rates and actually start reducing their interest rates to increase the value of the bonds and thus bailing out the banks. Of course, we can see the money printer potentially turn on as well. So there's a lot of things to unpack here. One of the main takeaways, though, is that if you have your money and we have vast amounts of capital in these regional banks, it's probably a good time to think about withdrawing it and putting it into something safer. Now, obviously, you can take it out of a bank and keep the cash. Chances are, though, that there's not enough cash in these banks to actually deal with that kind of demand. Moving it into a more safer environment, safer bet, hedging your bets with the metal markets or crypto markets. There's a lot of things to be done here. One of the things I want to leave you guys with in this video, though, is that you have to make a decision. If you leave your money in these regional banks, over the next 6 days, it could be one of the worst decisions that you make. Now, obviously, I am no financial advisor. I cannot give financial advice. All I can do is share my thoughts, my research, and the data that I have uncovered when it comes to this space, when it comes to the regional banks. And it's up to you guys to do that research, digging even deeper than I have, and come to terms with maybe your bank being okay, or your bank potentially being one of the ones that is of high risk. If you do have access to a financial advisor, you should probably consult them. They'll know what you should do better than I would, as they'll know your financial situation better than I ever could. Ultimately, I think we're kind of coming up to, in Q1 of 2024, a big pivot from the Federal Reserve. We do expect them to lower interest rates, and that is going to help out the banks. But before that happens, I think we're going to see a lot more damage. We're going to see, ultimately, in my opinion, a lot of these regional banks go under. We're going to see some of them swallowed up by the larger banks, and you're going to end up, in my opinion, with fewer larger banks rather than a diverse option pool of banks out there. Let me know what your thoughts are in the comments down below, and whether you are as concerned as I am when it comes to the next banking crisis. Why don't you check out this video here where I'm discussing Bitcoin's price action and how I believe we're not likely to see a fantastic $200,000 Bitcoin, but actually a more conservative $110,000 BTC.